Video is a Ret Paladin Iron Docks review. Unfortunately, I am going to have to apologise and say that this is only an 11 due to a few problems. I wasn't able to get into a 15 this week on my Paladin, probably because he's a little bit rusty and he didn't finish last season at 3k score. But we're still going to go through the video. This has kind of been prompted by one of our viewers. Few of you guys will know him as PD. And he sent me a video of his run through this. So we're going to take my 11, not quite the same as his 15, but we're going to go through it, talk about what I did, what could be done better, and kind of break this down. So hopefully it'll be helpful for you guys, for those of you that are still here for Ret Paladin content. And in the coming weeks, I will endeavour to get back into 15s on this guy, but Pug life is hard, unfortunately. So without any further delay, let's get into the video. So going into the video then, we're just going to pause it here for a second because this is a huge thing to discuss, and this is with the seasonal affix. You can obviously choose a bounty. Now, I did discuss this in my Warlocks Iron Docs about how this seasonal affix works with Shrouded, and you get essentially a stacking buff, a secondary stat buff for every Nathrezim you capture, with a named Nathrezim being worth a little bit more stats. Now, most guides will actually have you go haste. This is purely because of attack speed. It kind of speeds up your rotation. It also improves your out of war procs and things like that, because you got to remember haste does affect your auto swings. But you do also have the option of picking mastery, crit, or verse. Now, in this video, I actually go with crit because I was playing around and testing some stuff out, and I wanted to try and have a balance of stats throughout the dungeon, because I am still actually running an Old Warrior's Soul, so I get a considerable amount of haste through my trinket anyway, and as you can see at the start of this video, I have 30% haste baseline anyway. So I kind of felt that the crit might be beneficial here, although there is an argument to be made for mastery or just flat going more haste. My recommendation for you guys when it comes to this is picking, maybe run yourself a couple of sims, see what stats are simming the most. If you're not feeling comfortable with that, I'd default to haste. But if you do feel comfortable playing around your gear set slightly, if your simming is more relevant for crit, like say if you're a dwarf or a tauren, then go crit, else maybe increase your mastery / haste. Now, one thing I will say is this tank obviously isn't necessarily used to playing with Retribution Paladins, because very, very early on throughout this dungeon, we start having a lot of aggro problems. So I end up having to kind of play on the defensive quite a lot, and I am the PI target for this particular instance. Although the PIs really aren't lined up well at all. So you can see here that I was being targeted by the footman and kind of having to kite it around, because the tank is very, very slow on maintaining aggro. Now, one thing I should probably have done with this Battlemaster, and something I do get progressively better on throughout the course of the dungeon, is using Consecration. So there's been a period there where I should have just put it down. Now, Consecration doesn't do a lot of damage on its own. However, over the course of a dungeon, it's going to be free damage essentially in between globals while you're waiting for things, especially if you've got a lot of stacked up targets. Now, at the end of the dungeon, we will go over how much damage it is, and bearing in mind that it doesn't cost a resource, it just free damage to add. It's also very beneficial to use with something like a DK, because as you see, they put Death and Decay down, and they're pretty static. They're not going to be moving around a lot as you might see not Fury Warriors, Guardian Druids or Protection Warriors, as they can sometimes move around unnecessarily. Demon Hunters are also a really good example of a tank that you probably don't want to use Consecration that much for. Now, using Shield of the Righteous quite a lot here, partially for the extra damage, but also as just a defensive, because early on in packs we are going to be doing a reasonable amount of burst. Thankfully the rogue here kind of did most of the work for us, and we're waiting on our wings to come back up. Obviously here's the named Nathrezim, Zul'Gamox, that going into tomorrow's reset here in Europe is going to be nerfed slightly, so it's going to be somewhat easier to handle The nerf has already gone through in the US, I believe, or it will do as of their server restart today. Now, due to my Paladin being having no gear from this season and still being mostly geared from Season 3 / some of Season 2 with like Old Warrior Soul, I am using an Overwhelming Power Crystal. This is also something that I kind of wanted to test with in terms of how much crit I could play with to see if it was near enough possible to get, you know, upwards of 60 to 80% crit during Wings windows. That didn't seem to be the case, but we'll monitor that as we go through the rest of the dungeon, because they got to a point towards the end of the dungeon where I really didn't give a monkey's about my stats. I was just trying to not die constantly. Now, if we actually go back a couple of seconds, just as Zulgamox is about to go down, you'll see that we have obviously a Nathrezim there that we can take for additional stats, and we also have a second Nathrezim here. So there's an initial 4% stat that you can generate if you're pathing with, or you're properly pathing, because there's actually a point earlier in the later in the dungeon where we need extra percent. So if this is a route that you're taking, whether you're watching this as a tank or as a ret and you have a team to run with, might be worth picking up that Nathrezim there. It's a very, very easy pack to do, and the percentage is probably worth. Now, there's not too much to say in terms of standard DPS rotation, trying to make sure that Blade of Wrath is used, it's not kept on cooldown for too long, and you've got your Holy Power generating quite a lot. You can see that I am sitting on Out of War procs for a little bit longer than I should have done. My rotation should have been a little bit faster, and this is where, if you choose to go haste is going to be beneficial for you, because it will help speed up your rotation slightly, so you have less of these dead spots. But as you can see, I'm sitting at 35% haste, 26% crit, 49% mastery, and I have a between 5 and 10% verse window with a little bit of leech. So I'm somewhat tanky. Unfortunately, nowhere near tanky enough, because one thing that tanks are going to have to be wary of going forward is with Dreadfang and Norgar splitting in this second phase, I have full aggro on the boss, true, rather than on Dreadfang. Now, Paladin utility, bopping the priest, because that was the squishy target, has meant that we are somewhat safe. And again, I immediately grab aggro as soon as bubble dropped. Now, this kind of sucks because it massively tanked our damage, but at the same time, can't really be helped in a pug environment. What I could probably have done going into this, if I was to redo the exact same key again with the same team, is probably try and hold back a little bit on cooldowns. And unfortunately, this PI usage is really quite bad, because I have absolutely nothing to use with it. I don't have Divine Toll, I don't have Wings, and I don't even have Wake of Ashes. So this haste is nice, but it's not actually doing anything. This would probably have been better used on something like the Rogue or the Hunter, because the Hunter is survival. We're running a triple melee comp here, which isn't ideal. It means that the priest gets all the ranged mechanics, and as we all know, priests are rather squishy, so it's a bit of a shame. Now, Reckless Provocation again can be purged, magic purged. Very early on in this fight, I used my Belf Racial to remove it, and it just helps with the fight a little bit more, especially if you have a slightly squishier tank. So legendaries I'm using are obviously Tempest the Lightbringer and Unity on legs and waist respectively. Now, you're probably going to want to move Unity to wrists rather than legs if you're assuming pure base, but it's still not too shabby. Now, unfortunately, we kind of came here at a bad time because we end up missing that far patrol for percentage, which if I'd have hit it, then we'd have likely have seen some better usage in terms of percentage. So, because you can actually hit this entire pack with an Iron Starlet, either using the middle one or the far left, I suppose. Now, realistically, with this particular pack being as it is, you could probably pull it into the second with the Deckhand Chainmaster and this Ogron, because the Ogron actually converts into an Infiltrator, and dealing with these smaller Infiltrators are actually quite easy. Had the tank been slightly more aggressive and done this, this would have definitely helped our damage personally, because it would have aligned with wings much better. Again, kind of a curse of pugging, but one thing that we can do to counter that is obviously making sure that we use our cooldowns as often as possible. Now, getting caught by the cleave, a little bit of unnecessary damage, but thankfully it wasn't too bad. We're making use of Shield of Vengeance, bubbles being used appropriately. Could probably have used my strength pots more. I tend to be very reserved with them at the moment, purely because I'm trying to save money. But given the fact that I could spend a couple of hours just farming herbs and making them myself, I should really be a little bit more aggressive with them. So that's a little bit of criticism for me to take forward. Actually use my consumables. Because as you can see, I also have 147 health potions. My Warlock goes through them like candy, but my Paladin less so. Which rather seems counterintuitive when you think about it, given that my Paladin is usually in the shit more. But health is a resource. We need to make use of it. I have 99% more health than I need. Alright, so this is going to be an interesting moment, because this key was done very, very early this morning. Can't remember exactly what time. But it's interesting because I've popped wings and everything, and this means that realistically, at this moment in time, my wings shouldn't be up for the pull of the boss. Because again, like, this group's been fairly slow, and as you can see, I was the only one that popped cooldowns there. I was the only one that dealt with the Ogron. Now, during a fortified week, that's probably going to be required, because the Ogrons have a considerable amount of health, and that will only be further exaggerated during fortified weeks when mobs obviously have better scaling, or worse scaling, depending on your viewpoint. But given this is a tyrannical week, what I probably should have wanted to do is either space my wings out a little bit better, or just hold them. Because as you can see here, this pack, although it's rather slow to die, still means that I'm going to have about 40 seconds until I can use wings going into the boss. Which isn't ideal. Now, this boss is... your DPS is very much a result of how your tank plays. Because you can have all of these stacked, which thankfully this tank is going to do for us. And again, this PI, I've got no idea what the priest was doing, to be honest. So, rather irritating. Probably should have gone on someone that actually had cooldowns, but we'll make use of it as best we can. So you can see that with all three mobs stacked, Consecration goes down. What I probably should have done at this point is, given the fact that the Hunter had a debuff, probably should have tried bopping them, because these traps can be soaked, and you'll see that later on in the fight I do actually bubble and soak. So we use Shield of Vengeance, we go through our rotation bit, where we've got wings back. I force proc or Shield of Vengeance, or at least I try to, by standing in a Quaking. Probably not enough damage outright to do it, so I could probably have soaked one of the traps with a Shield of Vengeance as well, but you can see there that I soaked them up with Divine Shield, and this kind of just makes the fight space a little bit cleaner around all three, because as you can see, we're doing a relatively even split of damage between Drugu and Nox, with Emberblade obviously having considerably more health and taking longer to die. Now, as I discussed in my Warlock video, For Implosion Legendary, this is actually a really, really good boss for it. For Paladins, on the other hand, it's not too shabby. Could probably have got a lot more out of it in terms of maintaining Consecration down and less strafing, because I am still strafing quite a lot side to side where I shouldn't really need to. And Emberblade dashing away, what I probably should have done is been behind Emberblade so that whenever he dashed he was still getting caught by my extended Divine Storms through Tempest of the Lightbringer. Something else as well, looking back at this, that I should really have been more on top of is using Blessing of Sacrifice whenever I use my Shield of Vengeance. Because baseline, both of them have a 2-minute cooldown. You can obviously reduce Shield of Vengeance's cooldown to 90 seconds. But if you're not going to do that, using Blessing of Sac with Shield of Vengeance is probably also quite good, especially seeing as we've kind of established that both the other 2 DPS and the Priest are somewhat squishy. The Priest especially is taking a lot of damage that probably doesn't need to be taken, / can be avoided. And although Blessing of Sacrifice is sometimes quite scary, it is a relatively useful tool. Now, I am using Selfless I'm not using Healing Hands as talent, I'm using Selfless Healer, which means that I should really be using Flash of Light a little bit more aggressively as well, rather than just sitting on 4 stacks like I am currently. Again, we have another aggro situation. Thankfully, the DK deals with it this time, but you can kind of see where we're sat burst-wise. And we've got a reasonably nice spread of stats as well now, sitting at about 40% crit and 40% haste with nearly 50% mastery. Mastery is a little bit on the low side, so if I was to redo this key again, I might actually practice with Mastery, because Mastery is obviously a baseline increaser to all of our holy damage. Now, using essentially this hyper-aggressive use of Divine Shield and Shield of Vengeance is going to leave us in a bit of a pinch when it comes to this third boss, because Oshia, or the Saberon, is quite a healing intense fight, and as we're going to see, I actually get targeted by both of his feeding times, and because I don't have Bop or Divine Shield during the fight, it means that the healer has to do a lot more work. So I'm going to end up using Shield again. I believe it's this exact pack that we're about to go into where I end up popping it, and this is again because of aggro issues. Now, this PI kind of made sense because I had some cooldowns, but I still didn't have wings, so it was a bit of a weird place to put it. Now, I still have aggro, so that is a very, very, very late Bop on Divine Shield on me at 2k health. I also had Guardian Spirit, and I should probably have just trusted Guardian Spirit, but it's only now, when the Wrangler's at 20% health, do I lose aggro on it. Which is a very, very, very scary place to be. Which, in turn, is going to have a knock-on effect for the rest of this pack. Now, you can see that at this point, you need percentage. If you're at 93% here, you need to take this pack and the pack that the Hunter was contemplating going to get. So, pathing will become less of an issue as the season progresses. And this is obviously as tanks become familiar with it, because I appreciate that Warlords of Draenor was like 8 to 10 years ago now. So, there is probably a goodly number of players that are coming into the game now that either didn't play it then, or, to make me feel really old, weren't even born then. Or, you know, a twinkle in their dad's eyes. God, that does make me feel old. Anyway, I regret doing that, but if I've got to think of it, so do you. Now, Saberon fight, not too much to say really about this fight. From a melee perspective, don't stand in front of him. That's all you need to concern yourself with. Make sure you stand to the side or to the back. He is slightly problematic from a paladin perspective because his charges do force him to move faster than we can actually keep up at normal melee speed, and to add insult to injury, he also leaps around a lot. So this is probably one of those instances, especially for this boss and Skullock, the final boss, where you probably want to be using Cavalier and having 2 Divine Steeds. Now, for personal playstyle and for my own thing going forward, what I probably need to do is actually just hold back a second when these ads spawn, because you can see that all those wolves spawn, and although the wolves don't live for very long and can be easily burst down, they are very scary when 6 of them immediately turn and target you. So there's a lot of unnecessary backpedaling and not actually DPSing, because I just need to come off the pedal a little bit. And this is partially down to playing Warlock a lot and just a little bit of rust on my part. Now, this Wings was probably the wrong play. I probably should have held this Wings for the start of the boss fight, purely because of the fact that this boss is probably only going to live a few seconds longer than Wings itself, and obviously with me being targeted, I'm not really doing a whole hell of a lot other than trying to keep my ass alive. Now, at the moment, we're at about 14.5k DPS, and if it hadn't been for a few inopportune deaths, we'd probably be looking closer to 15, maybe 16k. But that could also just be down to simple, it's an 11, it's not a 15, mobs are dying somewhat faster, so I'm not really having time to get the full whack out of things, I suppose. Now, this particular encounter, from a paladin perspective, is problematic, and you're going to see why on 2 parts, 2 accounts. So the first account, again, another PI that makes no sense, and me having aggro on Skullock. So I just get absolutely slapped, and I wasn't particularly bursting very hard. But the problem is, because Koromar is the main target, we are spending tanks especially will tunnel vision Skull and not think to pick up aggro on auxiliary targets. Unfortunately for Retribution Paladins, a lot of our AoE is coded as single target. So a single Blood Boil, for instance, in the case of a Death Knight, and maybe a Heart Strike, isn't really going to do a whole hell of a lot. Now, that death was really unfortunate because it really lowered our total amount of damage that we're contributing to this fight, especially seeing as the fact that I had PI up at that moment. Now, thankfully, I didn't have wings. If I had wings, it would have been even more damaging. But you can see that even with wings up and kind of being able to do our damage here, we're rapidly climbing in terms of the total damage that we're doing for this encounter, despite having been dead for a while. And this is kind of one of the strengths that Paladins are going to have going into this season, especially if you do play around with either crit or haste as your bounty stat, because you can have these windows. Now, using crit for this particular dungeon, it kind of shows just how much that augments our wings damage. Now, I will do another key in the future where I do a different stat, and it will be another Iron Docs, and we'll have a look at just what my total damage would look like. Hopefully I won't die 10 seconds into that one, but by having crit and augmenting it, it makes wings a much stronger cooldown, essentially. Or at least that's my opinion, anyway, especially with my stats as they currently are. Because you can see now, going into this fight, towards the end of it, with Skullock, 34% haste, 38% crit, and 49% mastery. Obviously, that is changed slightly whenever I get Seraphim, because you can see there that I'm now at 80-odd% haste, with PI as well. So with the haste buff, that'd be 100% haste. Now, Grand Smash, you can bubble the knockback, as you can see there. The problem is, however, Cannon Barrage doesn't seem to have wanted to play ball, because I did attempt a kick. Now, the Rogue makes it across without much of a problem, and I don't know if that was an evasion or a feint or what, but they didn't take any damage, and we couldn't kick the interrupt. So what I probably should have done is held Shield of Vengeance, maybe health potted, had a cookie, and we'd have been in a better situation. But for an emergency case, you can immune that knockback. Now, obviously, we've got 0.5% to deal with, which kind of sucks. 3 deaths on my part, which isn't ideal. But we're still, hopefully, going to 2-chest this. Because, end of the day, just need to blow something up. Because it's a 0.5%. And we've got wings back, we've got all our burst, and we're going to be able to just go to town on something. But it is a relatively long run back. These dungeons are relatively punishing if you miss something, and they are also relatively punishing if you die as well, which isn't great. Rogue nearly goes down, we've got 14 seconds, wings, everything gets popped, and we just blow everything up, blow it up, blow it up, blow it up, and we 2-chest it with a second to spare, which isn't great. Now, the total damage for this dungeon at 16 million, and my 3 rather stupid deaths, probably means that we could have had maybe an extra 1 million damage total at the end of it, but this is the bit that I wanted to discuss. Now, obviously, I could have used Consecration a little bit more, especially during the more static fight, and if for some of the packs I wasn't necessarily running for my life, we'd have been able to do it. But Consecration contributed to 331k total damage, which 2% of my total damage doesn't sound like a lot, but when you consider that Blade of Justice, Truth's Wake, Hammer of Wrath are all within 1% in terms of total damage, for not requiring any holy power spender and being able to just consistently stay on the ground, it's a reasonable amount of damage and isn't something that I think should be neglected. Obviously, don't prioritize it over your other abilities, but remember that you do have that additional little bit of damage as you go through the dungeon. Now, it's been a while since I've done a Red Paladin video, so hopefully you guys have liked this, and it helps organize your thoughts if you're going back into Red or you're just playing Red for a seasonal thing. And as I said, I will get back into the habit of doing 15s on this and improving my own gameplay, so we can talk about the improvements maybe week on week as we go through Season 4 and we prep for Dragonflight. So thank you very much for watching the video. I will see you all in the next one, and I wish you all the best in your Mythic Plus vaults this week. Hope you get the Mechagon rings or trinkets if that's what you're after. Until next time, folks, have a good one and take care.